Elias Vance had built his life upon the bedrock of silence. In the year 1888, out in the vast, unforgiving throat of Coyote Canyon, silence was more than peace, it was a form of armor. It was the hard-packed earth that deadened the sound of approaching trouble. The vast, empty sky that swallowed secrets whole. Here, the law was a faded map in a distant office, and justice was a private negotiation between a man's conscience and the weight of the gun at his hip. For Elias. This quiet was a self-imposed creed, a fortress of solitude erected around the jagged memory of his father, a man of strong opinions and a loud, honest voice, who had argued his claim over a sliver of land and had been answered not with reason, but with a single, deafening gunshot. That solitary crack of a rifle had echoed through Elias's youth, teaching him a lesson that settled deep in his bones, that a man's world could be shattered by a single word spoken too loudly. And so, he had learned to speak the language of the land itself, a language of mended fences, watchful eyes, and a stillness that asked for nothing and betrayed even less. His ranch was a modest sanctuary carved into the foot of the imposing Starlight Ridge, a place of deliberate order amidst the canyon's chaotic beauty. He shared this isolation with the only person who understood his language of quiet. His mother, Eleanor. She was a woman whose own silence was a different entity entirely. It was not the locked room of his trauma, but a deep, calm reservoir of wisdom and unspoken strength. Their days moved with the steady, predictable rhythm of the seasons, the pre-dawn chill of the stables, the familiar weight of an axe, the slow, patient work of mending tack under the shade of a lone cottonwood. It was a fragile peace, purchased at the cost of ambition and connection, but it was the only currency Elias truly valued. He knew all too well that conflict was a wildfire, a living thing that began as an errant spark and fed on everything grass, wood, and men until all that remained was blackened earth and the stench of regret. On a blistering afternoon in late August, the sun hung in the sky like a white-hot coin, pressing down with such force that the air itself seemed to shimmer and warp above the scorched ground. The heat was a physical presence, a weight on the shoulders that made every breath a conscious effort. Elias was inspecting the southern fence line, a length of wire that marked the edge of his world. The air was thick with the sharp, clean scent of sun-baked pine and the dry, peppery aroma of sagebrush, while the drone of cicadas vibrated through the soles of his boots, a monotonous prayer to the relentless heat. He worked methodically, his calloused hands twisting wire with an ingrained muscle memory that left his mind free to wander. His gaze, a habit honed by a lifetime of solitude, swept the landscape, the muted grays and greens of the hardy scrub, the deep, rust-colored gashes in the ancient rock, the vast, unforgiving bowl of the sky. It was then, in a moment of utter normalcy, that a detail broke the pattern. A thin, dark line, stark and unnatural against the pale. Powdery dust. He paused, the wire strainer growing heavy in his hand. A shadow. Perhaps, but the sky was a flawless, searing sheet of cobalt, utterly devoid of clouds. He felt a cold prickle on his skin, a feeling that defied the oppressive heat. The line was too defined, too intentional. It felt like a tear in the fabric of his carefully constructed piece. He let the tool fall with a soft thud and walked towards it, his stride losing its easy rhythm. He crouched, the leather of his worn boots groaning in the heat. He hesitated for a moment before his fingers brushed the surface, gritty, and slightly damp beneath the desiccated top layer. It was blood, darkening to the color of rust but still holding a faint, coppery sheen that told him it was fresh, a long, continuous smear of violence. A visceral proclamation of pain and chaos painted directly across his threshold. His heart, which usually beat with a slow and steady rhythm, gave a hard, painful lurch. He lifted his gaze, and the cold dread that had begun as a prickle now settled deep in his stomach like a stone. The trail pointed in only one direction. It led, like an accusing finger, straight toward the quiet silhouette of his cabin. Every instinct for self-preservation, every lesson learned from his father's grave, urged him to turn, to mount his horse, and to ride until this stain on his land was nothing but a forgotten detail. The past was a ghost at his shoulder, whispering warnings of what happened to men who involved themselves in the affairs of others. But the blood was here, the outside world, with all its sharp edges and brutal conflicts, had not just knocked on his door, it had bled all over his welcome mat. The silence he had fought so hard to protect had been irrevocably shattered. He stood, his jaw tight, a muscle twitching beneath the sun-weathered skin. Then, with a slow exhale, he began to walk. He did not run. He moved with the grim deliberation of a man walking toward a fate he had not chosen but could no longer avoid. Each boot print in the dust was a reluctant step away from the life he had known. The familiar landscape around him now seemed alien and hostile. The drone of the cicadas was no longer monotonous. It was a shrill, incessant alarm. The scent of sage felt cloying, as if the earth itself was holding its breath. As the cabin came into full view, its pine boards weathered to a soft, silvery gray, he was struck by the profound, unnatural stillness of the place. It was a silence that felt different from his own, not peaceful, but hollowed out, as if the very air was holding a terrible secret. The gentle, rhythmic creak of his mother's rocking chair, the usual soundtrack to his afternoons, was gone. The familiar clatter of a pot from the kitchen, the sound of Eleanor preparing their simple evening meal, was absent. There was only the high, thin whine of the wind and the sawing of the insects, a cold fear, more potent than any he had felt since childhood, coiled in his chest. His right hand drifted down, his fingers brushing the smooth, worn wood of the revolver at his hip. It was a comfortless gesture, a reflexive acknowledgement that the rules of his world had just changed. The front door was unlatched, hanging slightly ajar. He placed his palm flat against the sun-warmed planks. The rough grain of familiar, grounding texture. He pushed, the hinges issued a low, protracted groan, the sound unnaturally loud in the heavy quiet. He stepped across the threshold, and the world shifted from blinding, white-hot glare to cool, deep shadow. The air inside was thick with the scent of pine wood, dried herbs, and something else, the faint, metallic tang of fear. It took a long moment for his eyes to adjust, for shapes to emerge from the gloom like memories surfacing from a deep well. And then he saw them. They were huddled in the far corner, a small, terrified tableau of humanity seeking refuge in the deepest shadows of the room. A woman was pressed against the wall as if trying to become one with the wood. She possessed a strange, arresting beauty, the kind one sees in a hawk or a gathering thunderhead, all sharp angles. Fierce intensity, and a sense of contained, volatile energy. Her dress, which might have once been a hopeful shade of cornflower blue, was now a tattered wreck, ripped at the hem and stained a deep, horrifying brown down one sleeve. A small boy, no older than 10, was slumped against her, his face ashen, his arm wrapped in a crude bandage of torn fabric, now soaked a dark, ugly crimson. Clinging to her skirt with a desperate tenacity were 2 smaller children, a girl of about 7, her face smudged with dirt, her tangled hair falling over eyes that were wide, solemn and ancient with things a child should never see, and a little boy, perhaps 4, who had buried his face so completely into his mother's side that he seemed more a part of her than a separate being, his tiny body trembling uncontrollably. The woman's head lifted, and her eyes wild, dark, and dilated with terror locked with his in their depths. He saw a whole landscape of flight and fear for a long, suspended moment. No one moved. The only sound was the frantic, shallow rhythm of her breathing, her chapped lips parted, and a voice, so faint it was like the ghost of a sound, frayed and fragile, reached across the space between them. "They'll kill us," she whispered, the words barely strong enough to carry. "They'll kill us if you tell." Elias stood rooted in the doorway, a silhouette caught between the harsh light of the world outside and the dark desperation within. He did not speak. He did not move. He let her desperate plea hang in the air. Let it settle in the quiet of the room. His gaze shifted from her haunted face, down to the small, trembling forms of her children, and finally rested on the ghastly bandage on the boy's arm. The knot was one of pure panic, a clumsy attempt to stop the unstoppable. And in that moment, the carefully constructed walls around his heart crumbled to dust. The sight of the terrified mother, the silent, watchful girl, and the wounded boy did not just ask for his help. It reached back through the years and took hold of the ghost of his own past. He saw his own mother, younger, her face a mask of disbelief and horror. He saw himself, a boy of 10, standing frozen over his father's still form. He saw the same senseless, brutal violence he had spent his entire adult life running from. And it was here, in his home, bleeding on his floor. The choice was simple. He could enforce the borders of his life, turn them out, and send the trouble on its way. He could reclaim his silence, or he could open the door. He could let the storm in. He took a single, slow step into the room, then another, his movements fluid and unthreatening. He knelt, not too close, his eyes never leaving the boy's pale face. He ignored the woman's sharp intake of breath, her flinch as he moved. He spoke, and his voice was the one he used with a spooked hoarse low, even and devoid of any emotion but a calm, steadying authority, a voice that promised no harm. "Let me see his arm." The woman Ilara went rigid. Her entire body was a shield, her arms tightening around her children. But something in his voice, something in his steady, unwavering gaze, seemed to breach her wall of terror. For a heartbeat, she wrestled with it. Then, with an almost imperceptible nod, her grip slackened. Just as Elias leaned forward, a floorboard creaked near the back of the cabin. His mother, Eleanor, appeared in the doorway of the kitchen. She carried no lamp, yet she seemed to bring a steady, quiet light into the room. She stopped, her eyes, as sharp and clear as a winter morning, took in the scene. She saw the intruder, the fear, the children, the blood. She saw the way her son was kneeling, the expression on his face. She saw the choice he was making. Her lips thinned into a resolute line, but she uttered no sound of surprise or protest. A lifetime of communication passed between mother and son in that single, silent glance. He did not need to ask. She did not need to be told. She turned with an economy of motion that belied her age, walked to the large wooden cupboard, and opened it. The quiet click of the latch was the loudest sound in the room. She took out a stack of clean linen cloths, a bottle of dark brown carbolic acid, and a small, sharp knife. Her movements were calm, efficient, and deliberate. Each action was a word in a silent conversation. Each item she placed on the table was a sentence. "We will help. We will face this. We are in this now." The fortress had fallen, not with a roar but with a whisper, and the quiet, steady clink of a glass bottle being placed on a wooden table. The storm was no longer at the door. It was inside. The soft, deliberate click of the glass bottle on the worn pine table was the only sound that followed Eleanor's silent declaration. It was an anchor in the swirling vortex of fear and uncertainty that had consumed the small cabin. Ilara flinched at the sound, her eyes darting from Elias, who was still kneeling on the floor, to the older woman whose presence filled the room with an authority that was as quiet as it was absolute. Elias rose slowly, his movements fluid, and took the offered supplies from his mother. He did not look at Alara again, but instead focused entirely on the wounded boy, creating a small, insulated world that consisted only of himself, the child, and the task at hand. His hands, which were broad, calloused, and mapped with the scars of a rancher's life, became instruments of surprising gentleness. With a small, sharp knife, he sliced through the blood-caked fabric, his touch so light it barely disturbed the boy's exhausted stillness. Alara watched, her breath held tight in her chest. She had seen men's hands before her husband's, which had been kind but clumsy, her pursuers, which were instruments of brute force. But Elias's hands were different. They worked with a focused, intricate grace, cleaning the deep, ragged gash on Leo's forearm with a steady precision that was both mesmerizing and deeply calming. He poured the stinging carbolic solution onto a clean cloth without hesitation, his expression unreadable. The boy, Leo, sucked in a sharp breath through his teeth, and his small body went rigid. But he did not cry out. A single, glistening tear escaped the corner of his eye and traced a clean path through the grime on his temple. Elias saw it, and for a fleeting moment, his methodical movements paused. He met the boy's gaze, and a flicker of something respect. Understanding passed between them before he continued his work, wrapping the wound in clean linen with firm, practiced efficiency, while Elias tended to the injury. Eleanor moved with a quiet purpose that began to slowly push back against the room's heavy atmosphere of terror. She stoked the embers in the wood stove. Her movements economical and sure, she did not coddle the two smaller children, but approached them with a grandmother's straightforward compassion. She knelt before the little girl, Cora, and held out a tin cup of water. The child stared, her solemn eyes wide and fearful, until Eleanor gave a small, encouraging nod. Cora's small hand trembled as she took the cup, and she drank with a thirst so desperate it was painful to watch. Eleanor then turned to the youngest, Finn, who was still trying to disappear into his mother's skirts. She simply placed a thick slice of freshly baked bread, spread with jam, into his small, clenched fist. For a long moment, the boy did not move. Then, the scent of the food seemed to penetrate his wall of fear. His fist uncurled, and he began to eat with a ravenous, frantic hunger that spoke of days of flight and deprivation. Ilara watched all of this as if from a great distance. A part of her was still out in the wilderness, running, listening for the sound of hoofbeats on hard-packed earth. But another part of her was here, in this quiet, shadowed room, witnessing a kindness so profound and unconditional it felt alien. These people had not asked for her story. They had not questioned her. They had seen a need, and they had met it. The hard, frozen knot of terror in her chest, a knot that had been tightening for weeks, began to loosen its grip. Just a fraction. When Leo's arm was bandaged and he was resting against a clean sack of flour Eleanor had placed against the wall, Alara finally found her voice again, though it was still a fragile, unsteady thing. "Thank you," she whispered to the room at large, the words feeling achingly inadequate. Eleanor simply nodded from across the room, while Elias, his task complete, merely stood and retreated into the quiet stoicism that seemed to be his natural state. That night, the cabin was transformed. The loft, normally used for storage, became a makeshift bedroom for Ilara and her children. The scent of hay mingling with the clean smell of the blankets Eleanor had provided. Down below, the air was no longer empty. It was filled with the soft, restless breathing of 4 sleeping strangers. Elias sat at the long wooden table long after his mother had retired to her small room, a single oil lamp casting a small, warm circle of light in the vast darkness. His rifle lay across the table, its oiled steel gleaming softly. He was a sentry now, a guardian of a peace he had not chosen but was now bound to protect. His mind replayed the events of the day, the crimson trail, the terror in Alara's eyes, the surprising weightlessness of the small, wounded boy. A question, cold and sharp, pushed at the edges of his consciousness. Who had they been running from? What kind of men would hunt a woman and her children through the unforgiving wilderness? The question had no answer, only a formless, menacing shape that lurked just beyond the reach of the lamplight. From the loft above, a floorboard creaked. He looked up and saw a silhouette move in the faint moonlight filtering through the small window. It was Alara. She was not sleeping. She was standing vigil, just as he was. Her gaze fixed on the dark, empty expanse of the canyon. They were two strangers, separated by a floor, but united in a shared, silent watchfulness, each guarding the other against a nameless threat. The next morning rose cool and clear, the brutal heat of the previous day having broken overnight. Elias made his decision before the sun had fully crested Starlight Ridge. They were low on flour and salt, and Leo would need a better disinfectant than the carbolic acid they had on hand. But more than that, he needed information. A nameless fear was a ghost, impossible to fight. He needed to give it a name. He saddled his horse in the pre-dawn gray, the leather creaking in the still air. Alara was already awake, sitting on the porch steps, her children still asleep in the loft. She watched him, her expression unreadable in the dim light. "I'm riding into redemption," he said, his voice low. It wasn't a question or an explanation, just a statement of fact. She simply nodded, clutching a thick shawl around her shoulders. "Be careful," she whispered, and the simple words held a weight of genuine concern that tightened something in his chest. The ride to the town of redemption was one he had made 1,000 times. But today, the familiar landscape felt charged with a new tension. The sunlight that spilled over the canyon rim, painting the rocks in hues of orange and gold, seemed sharper, more revealing. He found his gaze scanning the high ridges, searching the shadows between the junipers for any sign of movement. The wind, which usually carried only the scent of dust and sage, now seemed to whisper warnings he couldn't quite decipher. He was seeing the world through different eyes now, the eyes of a man with something to protect and something to fear. Redemption itself was hushed when he arrived, the single dusty street slumbering in the late morning sun. But the hush was not peaceful, it was strained, as he tied his horse outside the general store. He saw men he'd known for years, men who would normally raise a hand in greeting, suddenly find an urgent need to inspect a loose horseshoe or stare intently into the window of the assayer's office. Their avoidance was a palpable thing, a cold shoulder offered by an entire community. Inside the store, the low murmur of conversation ceased the moment he stepped through the door. The air grew heavy, each unasked question a physical weight between him and his neighbors. Mr. Albright, the proprietor, a man who had shared stories with Elias's father, now refused to meet his eyes, slamming a bag of flour onto the counter with enough force to send up a small white cloud. The message was clear: "You have brought trouble here." He was loading his supplies onto his horse when a familiar voice, deep and resonant, cut through the oppressive atmosphere. "Elias?" He turned to see Ben Carter standing in the massive doorway of his blacksmith shop, the fiery glow of the forge outlining his broad, powerful frame. Ben was a man as solid and reliable as the anvils he worked on, and his face, usually open and friendly, was etched with concern. He jerked his head, a silent invitation. Elias followed him into the cavernous, sweltering workshop, the rhythmic clang of a hammer on steel a welcome relief from the town's suffocating quiet. Ben didn't waste time with pleasantries. He led Elias to the back of the forge, away from any prying ears, his expression grim. "I heard you had visitors," he said, his voice a low rumble beneath the din of the smithy. Elias simply nodded, waiting. Ben wiped a sheen of sweat from his brow at the back of a grimy hand. "Be careful." Elias, more than careful. He leaned closer, his voice dropping further. Two men were in town yesterday, the Blackwood brothers, Silas and Gideon. The names landed in the hot, smoky air with a dead, heavy weight. Elias felt a cold recognition, though he'd only known them by their reputation, a reputation for ruthless ambition and casual brutality. They were asking questions. Ben continued, his eyes scanning the street outside, asking about a woman, a sister-in-law. Silas called her, said she'd run off with her young'uns, said she took something that didn't belong to her. Ben finally met Elias's gaze, his own eyes filled with a mixture of worry and grim resignation. That's not the worst of it. Elias? The Blackwoods. They hold the paper on half the businesses in this town. Albright's store, the saloon, my own forge. They're squeezing this canyon dry, and no one dares to cross them. Not even the sheriff. He placed a heavy hand on Elias's shoulder. I'm telling you this because your father was a good man. Don't get caught in the Blackwoods gears. They'll grind you to dust. The ride back to the cabin was a journey through a changed world. The nameless dread now had a name, Blackwood. The invisible threat now had a face and a motive. However false, it was a web of power and fear, with the entire town of Redemption caught in its strands. He wasn't just sheltering a family anymore. He was standing in defiance of the unofficial kings of Coyote Canyon. The weight of that knowledge was heavier than any saddlebag of supplies. He felt the familiar pull of his old instincts, the urge to retreat, to fortify his walls, to push the trouble away before it could take root. But then he pictured Ilara's face, the fierce, protective terror in her eyes. He pictured the small, solemn faces of her children. The choice had already been made. When he reached the cabin, Ilara was outside, mending a tear in a piece of canvas. Her hands, he noticed, steady and capable. She looked up as he approached, and her eyes immediately went to his face. She saw the new gravity there, the hard set of his jaw. She saw the supplies, and she saw that he had come back. He had walked into the heart of the danger and had willingly returned to her side. He didn't need to say a word. She understood. That evening, a fragile peace settled over the small cabin. By the flickering light of the single oil lamp, Elias sat at the table, methodically cleaning his rifle, the familiar scent of gun oil filling the air. He noticed a long tear in the sleeve of his work shirt, a snag from the barbed wire fence. As he was about to set it aside, Ilara rose from her chair in the corner. She moved without a sound, and before he could protest, she gently took the shirt from his hands. She retrieved Eleanor's small sewing kit from the mantelpiece, a small wooden box inlaid with mother of pearl. She sat down across from him at the table, the lamplight catching the warm, brown tones of her hair. He watched her as she threaded the needle with a practiced ease. He watched her small, capable hands guide the needle through the coarse fabric. Her stitches neat and even. It was a simple, domestic act, an act of quiet reciprocity. Each stitch was a word of thanks. Each pull of the thread was a strand in a new, tentative bond being woven between them in the deep, watchful quiet of the canyon. The air between them was no longer empty, but filled with a shared understanding, a fragile hope. For the first time in a long time, Elias Vance did not feel alone. He was no longer just a keeper of his own solitude. He was a defender of this newfound, precarious peace. And he knew, with a certainty as solid as the mountains around them, that the battle for it had just begun. The fragile peace that had settled within the Vance cabin lasted for 3 days. It was a tentative, delicate thing, a thin sheet of ice over a deep and turbulent river. In that time, a new unspoken rhythm took root. Alara, moving with a quiet efficiency, began to share the daily chores with Eleanor, her presence in the small kitchen becoming as natural as the scent of baking bread. The children, sensing the temporary safety of their haven, slowly unfurled from their tight buds of fear. Leo, his arm healing cleanly, would sit on the porch steps, meticulously carving a piece of scrap wood with a small knife Elias had given him. Cora, the solemn little girl, discovered a fascination with the ranch's few chickens, her quiet laughter a rare and precious sound as she scattered feed for them in the dusty yard. Even little Finn, who had been a fearful shadow, began to venture from his mother's side, his small hands patting the warm, patient nose of Elias's old horse. Elias observed this unfolding domesticity from a careful distance. He would watch from the barn door as Eleanor showed Alara how to mend a thick canvas sack. The two women's heads bent together in shared work. He would hear the children's voices, thin and reedy on the wind, and a feeling he couldn't quite name would settle in his chest. It was a warmth that was both comforting and terrifying. Each small sign of life returning to this broken family was a testament to the choice he had made, a validation that made the heavy weight of the name Blackwood seem, for a moment, bearable. But he was not a man given to illusion. He knew this quiet interlude was a gift, not a guarantee. He knew the shadow was still out there, lengthening in the afternoon sun, and that it was only a matter of time before it fell across his doorstep once more. The day it happened. The air was unnaturally still, the sky a high, hazy white that seemed to press the heat down into the canyon floor. There was no wind. The dust settled, and every sound carried with an unnerving clarity. Elias felt at first a subtle shift in the atmosphere, a tension that made the hairs on his arms stand up. He was splitting logs near the barn, the rhythmic thud of his axe a steady beat against the silence. He paused, axe in hand, and looked toward the low-slung hills that marked the entrance to his property. Two riders. They were not moving quickly. They rode with a slow, arrogant confidence, like men who believed the very ground they covered belonged to them. He watched them draw closer, his heart sinking into a cold, hard knot in his stomach. He recognized them from Ben Carter's description. Blackwood. He drove the axe deep into the chopping block and walked swiftly toward the cabin. Alara, he called, his voice low but urgent. Take the children inside now. She looked at him, saw the grim set of his jaw, and the blood drained from her face. Without a word, she gathered her children like a frantic mother hen and herded them through the cabin door. The latch clicked shut, a sound as final as a chambered round. Elias waited on the porch, his arms crossed over his chest. A moment later, Eleanor stepped out to stand beside him, her knitting left forgotten in her rocking chair. She did not speak, but her presence was a statement, a silent, unyielding declaration that this was her home, and she would not hide in it. The two riders pulled up just shy of the porch steps, their horses blowing steam into the hot, still air. They were a study in contrasts, a matched pair of menace. The one in the lead, Silas Blackwood, wore a fine, dark coat of a cut and fabric utterly out of place in the rugged canyon, its clean lines a stark insult to the surrounding dust. His boots were polished to a high sheen, reflecting the harsh, white sky. He was handsome in a sharp, predatory way, with cold, intelligent eyes and a smile that was a perfect, bloodless curve on his lips. The man beside him, his brother Gideon, was his opposite in every way. He was a mountain of a man, broad and brutal, his face a roadmap of old fights and cheap whiskey. He said nothing. his gaze fixed on the cabin door with a flat, possessive intensity. His stillness was more threatening than any overt gesture. The quiet promise of violence held in reserve. Silas Blackwood touched the brim of his hat in a gesture of mock courtesy. "Vance," he began, his voice smooth and cultured, a sound that was utterly alien in this place of rock and wind. "A fine piece of land you have here." "My compliments." Elias remained silent, his face a mask of stone. Silas's smile widened, though it never reached his eyes. "We won't waste your time. We've come for what is ours, a family matter. You understand? My late brother's wife, Alara, and her children. They seem to have lost their way." "She's not lost," Elias said, his voice flat and even. "And she's not leaving." Silas let out a soft chuckle, a sound of condescending amusement. "Ah, a misunderstanding. Then, you see, you operate under the assumption that she has a choice." He leaned forward in his saddle, his voice taking on a tone of feigned reason. "This isn't about a runaway woman. Vance, this is about legacy. My father and her husband's father. They had an agreement, sealed with a handshake right here in this canyon. A verbal contract, the kind that honorable men live and die by. This land she was on. The water that feeds it, it all flows from Blackwood Springs. She is, to put it plainly, a squatter on property that is part of our family's heritage. We are not cruel men. We are simply here to restore what is rightfully ours." It was a masterful performance. He painted himself as the wronged party, the enforcer of a sacred agreement, and Alara as a foolish, misguided woman. He wasn't a kidnapper. He was a restorer of order. Gideon shifted in his saddle, the leather creaking loudly, his hand resting casually on the butt of his pistol. His silent presence punctuated every one of Silas's smooth, poisonous words. Elias felt a cold fury rise within him. He saw the lie for what it was, a carefully crafted justification for greed. A legalistic cloak thrown over simple thuggery. "I've heard your story," Elias said, his voice dangerously low. "She is under my protection. This is my land. You are not welcome here." The smile finally vanished from Silas Blackwood's face, replaced by a look of cold, reptilian assessment. He looked from Elias to Eleanor, who stood unflinching beside her son. He let his gaze drift over the simple, well-kept cabin, the neatly stacked firewood, the signs of a life of hard work and quiet dignity. A man's principles are an expensive thing to own in this canyon. "Vance," Silas said softly, his voice now laced with undisguised menace. "I do hope you can afford the cost." He gathered his reins, gave a curt nod to his brother, and they turned their horses. They rode away at the same slow, arrogant pace at which they had arrived, leaving behind an unspoken threat that poisoned the air far more than any shouted curse could. The aftermath was not immediate, but it was insidious. The invisible walls of Elias's world began to close in. 2 days later, a sharp crack echoed against the cabin wall. Elias rushed outside to find Cora crying, a small, jagged rock lying in the dust near her feet. He looked up toward the low ridge that overlooked his property and saw the fleeting shapes of 2 boys. Their mocking laughter carried on the wind as they disappeared. The town was turning on him, using its children as messengers of its displeasure. The sanctuary had been violated. The following afternoon, Sheriff Cole rode out, his horse's gait as weary as the slump of his own shoulders. He was a good man, but a man worn thin by the thankless task of trying to impose order on a place that fundamentally rejected it. He dismounted, his face lined with genuine worry. "Elias," he said, foregoing any preamble, "I need you to understand the situation. I can't protect you if you insist on making this your fight. Silas Blackwood came to my office. He didn't make threats. He just talked. talked about old agreements. Our family's name and legacy. He's painting you as a man harboring a thief and interfering in a family dispute. The sheriff sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. People are scared. Elias? The Blackwoods own them. One way or another, that verbal agreement story, it's just plausible enough for folks to cling to. To justify looking the other way, I'm telling you as a friend, not as the law, because out here, I'm not sure which one has more power. Be careful. He mounted his horse and rode away, leaving Elias with the bitter taste of his own isolation. The law itself had just told him he was on his own. That evening, the mood inside the cabin was heavy and suffocating. The thrown rock had left a spiderweb crack in one of the window panes, a constant, physical reminder of their siege. Alara moved about the room with a haunted, restless energy, her hands constantly twisting the fabric of her apron. She would stop, stare at the crack in the glass, and then begin her pacing anew, a caged animal consumed by guilt. Finally, as Elias was inspecting the new scar on the cabin wall, she stopped beside him. Her pacing ceased, but her hands continued their frantic work. "This is my fault," she whispered, her voice choked with self-reproach. "All of this, the rock, the sheriff. I should have kept running." Elias turned to face her, his expression unreadable in the dim lamplight. "Where would you have gone?" he asked, his voice softer than she expected. Her composure crumbled. "I don't know," she admitted, her voice breaking. She looked at him, her eyes pleading for understanding. "It wasn't supposed to be like this. After my husband, Daniel, died, it started slowly. Silas came by, offering to buy the land. He said it was too much for a woman to handle alone. I said no. Then he came back and said Daniel had owed him money, a debt I knew nothing about. He offered to forgive the debt in exchange for the deed." She wrapped her arms around herself, shivering despite the warmth of the room. "It was a lie, all of it. They were trying to squeeze me out, to make me so desperate I'd give in. I kept saying no. That's when it got worse." She stopped, unable to continue, the rest of her story a dark, unspoken shadow. He listened without interruption, his gaze steady on her face. Her partial confession didn't change anything for him, except to harden the lines of his resolve. He wasn't just protecting a stranger anymore. He was standing against a creeping, predatory evil, the kind that preyed on the grieving and the vulnerable. He looked past her, through the cracked window, into the vast, indifferent darkness of the canyon. The quiet life he had so carefully constructed was gone, shattered into 1,000 pieces. In its place was this new reality, a fight for a woman he barely knew, for children who were not his, against an enemy that held a whole town in its thrall, and for the first time since his father's death. The thought of the fight ahead did not fill him with fear. It filled him with a cold, clear and unwavering sense of purpose. The cold, clear purpose that had settled in Elias's soul was a brittle thing, tested each day by the suffocating weight of watchful eyes and silent condemnation. For a week, an uneasy quiet fell over the ranch, a quiet that felt less like peace and more like the held breath before a thunderstorm. The sky remained a high, indifferent blue, but storms were gathering on the horizon of their lives. Elias worked with a grim, focused energy, his every action now part of a larger vigilance. He reinforced the cabin door, reset the window pane that had been cracked, and spent his evenings methodically cleaning his rifle and revolver. The scent of gun oil a constant, sharp reminder of the violence that simmered just beyond their fence line. Inside the cabin, a similar tension reigned. Alara and Eleanor worked together, their shared tasks a silent language of solidarity, while the children played in a shrinking perimeter around the house. Their laughter now more subdued, their eyes often straying to the ridges where the memory of the rock-throwing boys lingered. the storm, when it finally broke, came on a moonless night. It started not with rain, but with a low, mournful wind that moaned through the narrow passes of Coyote Canyon, rattling the shingles of the cabin and making the oil lamp flicker and dance. The sky, which had been clear at sunset, was now a roiling sea of bruised, black clouds. Distant lightning silently illuminated the horizon, revealing the tormented shapes of the clouds for a split second before plunging the world back into an even deeper darkness. The air grew heavy, charged with electricity and a sense of impending chaos. Elias, feeling a deep disquiet in his bones, knew he couldn't rest. The animals in the barn would be spooked by the approaching storm. "I'm going to check on the horses," he said into the charged quiet of the room. Eleanor nodded, her knitting needles clicking with a steady, defiant rhythm. Alara looked up from the loft where she was watching her sleeping children, her eyes dark with a shared anxiety. The wind tore at Elias as he crossed the short distance to the barn, whipping dust and stray leaves into his face. Inside, the familiar scent of hay and horse was a small comfort. He spoke in a low, calming voice to the animals, his hands running along their powerful necks as thunder began to rumble. Closer now, a deep, guttural growl from the belly of the sky. He secured the latch on the large barn door, his mind preoccupied with the thought that the storm provided perfect cover for men who moved in darkness. As the first heavy drops of rain began to hammer against the barn roof like a frantic drumbeat, he heard it. It was not the thunder. It was a sound that cut through the roar of the wind, a sharp, splintering crash of wood, followed by a woman's sharp, commanding cry, his mother. He moved before the thought had even fully formed. He threw the barn door open and sprinted through the now driving rain, the world a chaotic mess of wind, water, and roaring darkness. The light spilling from the cabin's open doorway was a chaotic, flickering beacon. The door itself was gone, kicked clean off its hinges and lying splintered on the porch, and framed in the doorway were three hulking figures, their forms slick with rain, bringing the storm inside with them. Two were rough-looking men he didn't recognize, but the one in the center, the largest of the three, was Gideon Blackwood? His face was a mask of brutal intent, his eyes sweeping the room with a predator's hungry gaze. In the center of the room, his mother stood, not cowering, but rooted to the floor like an old, unyielding oak. The long barrel of the shotgun she kept over the hearth was leveled in her steady hands, aimed directly at Gideon's chest. "Get out of my house!" Eleanor's voice rang out, clear and hard as flint, miraculously cutting through the din of the storm. Gideon let out a wet, ugly laugh. "Brave words. Old woman," he sneered. "You got 10 seconds to put that thing down before I take it from you and break you in half with it." He took a menacing step forward and then jerked his chin toward one of his men. "Check upstairs. Find the brats." From the shadows of the loft, Alara watched in pure, heart-stopping terror. The man started toward the ladder, a cruel grin on his face. In that instant, something inside her snapped. The weeks of fear, of running, of helpless guilt, coalesced into a single, explosive point of pure, primal rage. Her children. They were not going to touch her children. Her eyes darted around the dim loft, landing on the heavy, black cast-iron skillet she had used that morning to cook corn cakes. It was an object of domesticity, of nourishment. Now it became a weapon. She scrambled forward, her movements silent, and seized it. The skillet was heavy, solid, an anchor of righteous fury in her trembling hands. She didn't scream. Her action was the scream, with a guttural cry born of a mother's desperation. She rose up and hurled the skillet with every ounce of her strength. She wasn't aiming to hit the man, but to shatter the world. The heavy iron pan cartwheeled through the air and smashed against the log wall just inches from the henchman's head. The sound was deafening, a concussive, metallic clang that was louder than the thunder outside. Wood splintered. The man cried out in shock, stumbling back from the ladder, his hands flying up to his head. Gideon and the other man flinched violently, their heads whipping around toward the unexpected source of this new, chaotic violence for one crucial, heart-stopping second. All three of them were distracted, their focus broken, their brutal momentum stalled. That second was all Elias needed. He hit the doorway not like a man, but like a physical embodiment of the storm itself, a torrent of righteous fury. He slammed into the henchman closest to the door, his shoulder driving into the man's chest with the force of a battering ram. The man grunted, the air exploding from his lungs, and went down in a heap, his head cracking against the floorboards. The second man, recovering from the shock of the skillet, swung a wild punch. Elias, moving on pure instinct, ducked under the blow, caught the man's wrist, and twisted. A wet, sickening pop echoed in the room, followed by a high-pitched scream of agony as the man crumpled. Cradling his now useless arm, the fight was a whirlwind of desperate, close-quarters brutality. It was not a duel, it was a brawl for survival, fueled by the thunder outside and the violent pounding of blood in Elias's ears. The air was thick with the smell of wet wool, stale whiskey, and the sudden, coppery tang of fear. Gideon, seeing his men dispatched so quickly, snarled and abandoned any pretense of a fistfight. A knife appeared in his hand, the blade winking wickedly in the lamplight. He lunged, not at Elias's chest, but low, a killer's move. As he moved, a fleeting image burned in Elias's mind, his father, falling. But where his father had fallen, Elias would stand. He twisted, but not fast enough. A searing, white-hot pain exploded in his left forearm as the blade sliced deep, laying the flesh open to the bone. The pain, instead of incapacitating him, ignited the last reserves of his adrenaline. He let out a roar of his own and charged forward. Ignoring the fire in his arm, he drove his head into Gideon's face. The impact a solid, crunching thud. The big man staggered back, blood pouring from his nose, his eyes wide with surprise and a flicker of fear. He was a bully, accustomed to his victims cowering. He was not prepared for a man who would fight through a knife wound. Seeing the fury in Elias's eyes, Gideon made his choice. He scrambled backward, stumbled out the broken doorway, and vanished into the roaring. Black chaos of the storm, his parting curse snatched away by the wind. "This ain't over, Vance!" A sudden, ringing silence descended upon the cabin, a vacuum where the violence had been. It was broken only by the drumming of the rain on the roof, the whimpering of the man with the broken wrist, and the ragged, desperate gasps of those left standing. The room was a wreck, overturned furniture, splintered wood, and the dark, spreading pool of blood on the floor where Elias stood, his arm dripping crimson onto the pine boards. Alara saw the blood, and the last of her strength, the last of her rage, deserted her. A low, wounded sound escaped her throat. She scrambled down the ladder, her eyes fixed on the wound, on the physical proof of the price he was paying to protect her. The guilt, the fear, and the horror she had held back for so long finally broke through in a devastating flood. "No, no, no," she sobbed, rushing to his side. Her hands hovering uselessly over the gruesome injury, Eleanor was already there, tearing a clean strip from a tablecloth. Her face grim, but her hands steady. But Alara could not be stopped. The sight of his blood had broken the final dam within her. "It's not just about the debt," she cried, the words tumbling out in a torrent of confession, each one tearing a new wound in the fragile quiet. There was no debt. He forged the papers. Elias Daniels' signature. It wasn't his, I knew it, but I couldn't prove it. She was weeping openly now, her face buried in her hands. When I wouldn't leave, they poisoned our well. The water. It started tasting strange. Our cow got sick, then she died. I knew it was them. But the sheriff, he just said I had no proof. She looked up at him, her face a mask of utter despair. That's why I ran. That's why Leah was hurt. We weren't just running from them. We were running from the land itself, because they had poisoned it against us. I took nothing but my children because there was nothing left to take. Elias listened, the searing pain in his arm fading to a dull throb as a different kind of fire began to burn in his veins. He looked at Alara's tear-streaked face, and he finally understood the true depth of the evil they were facing. This was not a dispute over land. This was a calculated, cruel campaign of destruction aimed at a grieving widow and her children. It was a poison not just in the well, but in the heart of the canyon. Eleanor finished tying the makeshift bandage, her mouth a thin, hard line of fury. Elias looked from his mother's face to Ilara's, and his own expression settled into one of absolute, unshakable resolve. The time for defense, for hiding, for hoping the storm would pass, was over. He had to ride into the heart of it. He reached out with his good hand and placed it gently on Alara's shoulder. She flinched, then leaned into his touch. He waited until her sobs quieted, until her eyes met his. "We're done running," he said, his voice calm, clear, and as solid as bedrock. "Tomorrow, we ride to redemption." The dawn that followed the storm was unnaturally quiet, the air scrubbed clean and sharp by the night's violence. Inside the Vance cabin, the new day did not bring relief, but a stark, cold clarity. The wreckage of the attack lay around them, the splintered door, the overturned table, the dark, ugly stain on the floorboards where Elias's blood had soaked into the wood. But there was a change in the atmosphere that went deeper than the physical disarray. The cloying tension of fear had been replaced by the steely calm of resolve. There was no more hiding, no more waiting. The fight had come to them, and now they would take the fight back to its source. Eleanor, her face a mask of grim determination, was the first to move, sweeping up the shards of a broken lantern with steady, deliberate hands. Ilara, her eyes red-rimmed but no longer filled with despair, worked alongside her, her movements quick and purposeful. She cleaned and rebandaged Elias's arm with a newfound confidence, her touch gentle but firm, a silent apology and a promise all in one. The children were subdued, watching the adults with wide, serious eyes, sensing the monumental shift in the currents of their lives. Elias himself moved with a stiff, painful grace, his wounded arm a constant, throbbing reminder of the previous night, but the pain only seemed to fuel the fire in his gut. While the women restored order to the cabin, he prepared the wagon, his jaw set, his mind focused on the journey ahead. He was no longer a man reacting to events. He was a man setting them in motion. They left the ranch an hour after sunrise, a small, defiant procession against the vast, indifferent landscape of the canyon. Eleanor and the children sat in the back of the wagon, a tight, protective unit. Ilara sat on the driver's bench, the reins held firmly in her hands, her back straight and her gaze fixed forward. Elias rode alongside on his horse, his rifle resting in the scabbard at his knee. He was their outrider, their guardian, his presence a clear and visible statement. They were not a band of fugitives anymore, they were a family, riding into the heart of a hostile town to demand justice. As they neared redemption, the world seemed to hold its breath. The few ranchers they passed in the open country stopped their work to stare, their faces unreadable masks of curiosity and apprehension. When they reached the town's single dusty street, a palpable hush fell. Doors that had been open were quietly closed. Faces that had been visible in windows vanished behind curtains. The blacksmith's hammer, which usually rang out with cheerful industry, was ominously still. Men lounging on the saloon porch froze, their conversations dying in their throats. The entire town stopped to watch them pass, their eyes following the slow, deliberate progress of the wagon. It was not a silence of respect, but of fear a collective, fearful waiting to see which way the wind would blow, which power would prevail. Elias felt their stares like a physical weight, but he did not flinch. He kept his eyes forward, his gaze sweeping the street. A protector leading his flock through a valley of wolves. They did not stop until they reached the small, clapboard building with the faded sign that read, Sheriff. Elias dismounted and helped his mother and the children down from the wagon before turning to Alara. He offered her his good hand, and she took it, her grip firm and steady. Together. They walked up the steps and into the sheriff's office. Sheriff Cole was sitting at his desk, a mountain of paperwork before him. He looked up as they entered, and his weary expression transformed when he saw them. He saw Elias's bandaged arm, Ilara's unwavering gaze, and the solemn procession of their family. The hesitation that had plagued him for days evaporated, replaced by the grim resolve of a man who knew his moment of truth had arrived. He stood up slowly, his duty finally outweighing his fear. "Alara," he said, his voice quiet but clear. "Are you ready to make a formal statement?" She nodded once, a sharp, definitive movement, for the next hour, in the quiet. Dusty office that smelled of stale coffee and old ink. She told her story. Not the fractured, partial truth of before, but the whole. Ugly saga, the forged deed. The threats, the poisoned well. The attack on the cabin. Sheriff Cole wrote it all down, his pen scratching across the paper. Each word a nail in Silas Blackwood's coffin. When it was done, he turned the paper toward her. "Sign here," he said. Alara took the pen, and with a hand that did not tremble, she signed her name. It was more than a signature, it was an act of reclamation, of taking back her own story. As the ink was drying, a long shadow fell across the open doorway. Well, isn't this a touching domestic scene? Silas Blackwood stood there, flanked by Gideon and two of their men. His smile was a predatory slash, his eyes glittering with cold amusement as they took in the scene. He ignored Elias and the sheriff, his gaze locking onto Alara. "Time to come home. Clara," he said, his voice a honeyed poison, deliberately using her full name to assert his ownership. But the woman who faced him was not the terrified creature who had huddled in the corner of Elias's cabin. That woman was gone, burned away in the fire of the previous night. Alara stood up, her small frame radiating a strength that seemed impossible. She met his gaze without flinching. "My name is Alara," she said, her voice clear and ringing in the quiet office. "And I am already home." The air in the room grew thick, charged with the promise of violence. But before Silas could respond, Sheriff Cole stepped forward, his hand resting on the badge pinned to his chest. It seemed to shine with a renewed authority. "That's enough," he said, his voice firm. "Silas Blackwood, by the authority vested in me by the territory, you are under arrest for assault, conspiracy, and the forgery of legal documents." For a moment, no one breathed. The entire world seemed to hang suspended in that one. Silent second. Then Gideon's hand, which had been resting near his gun, twitched. It was a movement as small as a snake's tongue, but in the tense quiet, it was a declaration. But Elias had been waiting for it. Before Gideon's fingers could even brush the worn leather of his holster, Elias's own revolver was in his hand, the hammer drawn back with a loud, definitive click. The sound was surgical, cutting through the tension, and in that small room, it was louder than any thunder. Gideon froze. his eyes wide, his hand hovering uselessly in the air. The sheriff's hand tightened on his own weapon. Ilara drew in a sharp breath. Silas stared at the unwavering barrel of Elias's gun, then back at the sheriff. A short, sharp, humorless laugh escaped his lips. He slowly raised his hands. "You think this ends here?" he sneered at the sheriff, his eyes burning with a cold, hateful fire. "You think a piece of paper and a tin star can change the way things are in this canyon? The law doesn't reach to the top of Starlight Ridge." The sheriff cuffed him, the metallic ratchet of the handcuffs sealing the small, temporary victory. As he was led past Elias, Silas paused, his face a mask of pure venom. "This isn't over." Vance? Not by a long shot. He was marched across the street to the small, iron-barred jail cell, the assembled townsfolk watching in a stunned, disbelieving silence. They had just witnessed the impossible, the untouchable Silas Blackwood put in chains, but the victory felt fragile, incomplete. Gideon and his men did not disperse. They exchanged a long, hard look with their captured leader, then mounted their horses. But instead of riding out of town, they turned their horses and rode slowly, deliberately, toward the low hills that overlooked Redemption. They spurred their horses up the steep incline, their dark shapes stark against the bright, unforgiving sky. They stopped at the crest of the ridge, 4 silent silhouettes watching over the town like vultures waiting for a sign of weakness. A low murmur of fear went through the crowd. The immediate threat had been caged, but a new, more insidious one had just taken its place. Silas in a cell was one thing, but Gideon, his loyal, brutal dog, was off the leash, watching them. The town of Redemption had not been freed. It had just been placed under siege. The fight was no longer about one family or one piece of land. It was now about the soul of the entire town, trapped under the silent, menacing gaze of the men on the ridge. For 2 long days, the town of Redemption and its unwilling guests lived under the silent, menacing watch of the men on the ridge. Ilara found that this new phase of fear was somehow worse than the frantic chase through the wilderness. It was a cold, suffocating dread, a psychological siege where the enemy was always visible, their dark silhouettes a constant, mocking reminder of the fragile nature of the law in a cage and the freedom of the wolves who still roam the hills. The streets of the town were deserted, a ghost town populated by fearful whispers behind closed doors. The children remained inside the small room adjoining the sheriff's office that had become their temporary sanctuary, their games now quiet and subdued. Elias became a coiled spring of tension, his gaze constantly straying to the ridge. His hand never far from his revolver. He and Sheriff Cole took turns on watch, their shared vigil a grim acknowledgement that Silas Blackwood's capture had not ended the war, but merely changed the battlefield. The silence from the ridge was a weapon in itself. Gideon and his men made no move, fired no shots. They simply watched, their patience a testament to their confidence. They knew the town's fear was their greatest ally. They were waiting for the fragile coalition of defiance to crumble, for the townsfolk to turn on Elias and his new family, blaming them for the paralysis that had gripped their lives. Elias felt the weight of it all settling on his shoulders. He had dragged this entire town into his fight, and he could see in the fleeting, resentful glances he received that their support was as thin as a whisper of smoke. He had won the battle in the sheriff's office, but he was losing the war for the soul of Redemption. The change came on the 3rd morning, with the first pale, rosy light of dawn. It did not come with a trumpet blast or a cavalry charge. It came in the form of a small, anonymous act of courage. As Elias stepped out into the chilly air for his turn on watch, his eyes fell upon his wagon, which was still parked in the middle of the street. There, sitting on the driver's bench, was a simple loaf of bread, still warm enough that a faint wisp of steam rose from it into the cool morning. It was wrapped in a clean, checkered cloth, There was no note. There was no messenger. There was only the offering itself, a quiet, powerful declaration that they were not entirely alone. Elias stared at it for a long moment, a hard lump forming in his throat. He picked it up, the warmth of it seeping into his cold hands, and it felt heavier and more precious than gold. That small act of defiance seemed to break a spell. An hour later, as the sun climbed higher, another figure emerged into the empty street. It was Ben Carter, the blacksmith. He did not skulk or hurry. He walked with a steady, deliberate stride from his forge, carrying a small wooden crate. He walked directly to Elias and set the crate down. Inside were 4 newly forged horseshoes and a bag of nails. A horse with a loose shoe is no good in a fight. Or a retreat, Ben said, his voice loud enough for anyone listening behind their curtains to hear. It was a practical gift, but its symbolism was immense. It was a public declaration of allegiance. A nail driven into the coffin of the town sphere from the ridge. Gideon Blackwood and his men watched this display, their forms rigid with disapproval. They had expected the town to starve Elias out with their silence. They had not expected this. And the rebellion, once started, began to spread. The storekeeper's wife, a woman who had previously looked through Elias as if he were glass, scurried across the street and left a small jug of fresh milk near the sheriff's door before hurrying away. Later, a basket of late-season vegetables appeared. Each offering was a quiet vote, a small act of joining the fight. Gideon's siege, meant to isolate and break them, was having the opposite effect. It was forging the disparate, fearful people of redemption into a community. Later that afternoon, a new dust cloud appeared on the horizon, but this one was different. It was larger, more purposeful, and it resolved itself not into a band of riders, but into a heavy, well-built stagecoach that thundered into town and pulled up before the hotel. A man stepped out, tall and stern, dressed in a black suit that was immaculate despite the journey. He had a formidable presence, his graying temples and sharp, intelligent eyes radiating an authority that was intrinsic, not pinned on. This was not a man who requested respect. He commanded it. He was Federal Judge Marcus Holloway, arriving 2 days ahead of his circuit schedule. The arrival of a federal judge in redemption was like the arrival of a king. His authority superseded everything the local sheriff, local disputes, and certainly the unspoken rule of the Blackwoods. When Sheriff Cole, with Elias and Alara at his side, presented the judge with Alara's sworn statement and the tale of the siege, Judge Holloway's face became a mask of cold, judicial fury. He declared his intention to convene a territorial court right there in Redemption, to try Silas Blackwood for his crimes, and to issue federal warrants for the arrest of Gideon Blackwood and any man who stood with him on that ridge. For the armed intimidation of a township, the law, the real, powerful, unblinking law, had finally arrived. That night, as if summoned by the dramatic shift in power, the wind began to howl, a great dust storm, born in the distant plains, descended upon the canyon, a churning, blinding wall of red grit that swallowed the world. It raged for hours, a violent, chaotic force that seemed intent on scouring the very memory of the Blackwoods from the land. And when the dawn came, the wind had died, and the air was calm and clear. Elias, the sheriff, and half the town stood in the street. Their eyes turned to the ridge. It was empty, under the cover of the storm. Gideon and his men had vanished. They had recognized a power they could not intimidate, a fight they could no longer win, and they had melted back into the lawless territories from which they came. A collective sigh of relief, deep and profound, seemed to rise from the entire town. The siege was over. The seasons turned. The harsh sun of summer softened into the golden light of autumn. The scars on the land, like the ones on their hearts, began to fade in the small white church at the edge of town, with the entire community of redemption watching. Elias Vance and Elora Dunn were married. Eleanor sat in the front pew, her face a portrait of quiet joy, with Leo, Cora, and Finn pressed close beside her. The words spoken were simple, but they were imbued with the weight of all they had endured and all they had become. Later, on a warm afternoon, Elias sat on the porch of his own cabin, the wood of the repaired door warm at his back. Elara sat beside him, a comfortable, peaceful silence between them as they watched the children play in the yard. Their laughter was loud and free now, a sound that filled the canyon with a music he had never known he was missing. He looked out over his land, at the wide, endless sweep of the valley under a sky so blue it seemed carved from glass. He thought of that first day, of the vet mow in the dust, and the terror that had come with it. He had once believed that strength was a fortress of silence, a man standing alone against the world. But he had been wrong. The true turning point had not been his gun, or even the law. It had been a single loaf of bread, left on a wagon seat in the pre-dawn chill. It was the courage of the first person to be kind. He had learned that bravery wasn't just about the willingness to fight, but about the willingness to connect, to risk a piece of oneself for another. And perhaps that, he thought, as he reached for his wife's hand and felt her fingers twine with his, was how love grew, too, not in the grand, dramatic moments, but in the quiet, steady accumulation of small, courageous acts of kindness, blooming against all odds, in the heart of the unforgiving West.